Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana.
This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we're really excited to be joined by Kristina Gorcheva-Newberry. Kristina's stories and essays appeared or are forthcoming in many publications and magazines: Subtropic, Zoetrope, All Story, Joyland, Electric Literature, The Southern Review, Indiana Review, Epiphany, Gulf Coast, Tri-Quarterly, Flyway, Slice, Prairie Schooner, Nimrod, and elsewhere. Her fiction was selected as a finalist for multiple awards, including 8 Pushcart nominations, the 2016 Dundee International Book Prize, the 2019 Prairie Schooner Book Prize, and the 2020 Indiana Review Fiction Prize. Kristina is the winner of the 2013 Catherine Ann Porter Prize for Fiction, the 2015 Tennessee Williams Scholarship for the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the 2020 Raz Schumacher Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Fiction for her first collection of stories, What Isn't Remembered, which was longlisted for the 2022 Penn/Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Short Story Collection. And I just got the note, What Isn't Remembered has also been shortlisted for the 2022 Stanford Library's William Saroyan International Prize. It's a lot of prizes. Kristina is a Russian-Armenian emigre who was raised by a mother who believed that unless you read every day, you did not deserve dinner. Kristina graduated from Moscow State Linguistic University and worked as a school teacher and an interpreter before moving to the United States. She received an MA in English from Radford University and an MFA in creative writing from Hollins University. We are here, of course, to talk about Kristina's debut novel, The Orchard, which was recently published in March of 2022 by Ballantine Books, which is a division of Penguin Random House. So, Kristina, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any plugs, anything you want to talk at the beginning, please.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor. I've been listening to your podcast, and it has the most fascinating name, Tipsy Tolstoy.
Well, we spent a lot of time picking the name. We are really excited. We had both a really good time reading The Orchard.
Mm-hmm.
A good time till certain parts, and it was just a real kick, like a roundhouse kick in the gut at certain points. But we can talk about that.
Yes. But before we get into talking about the reading today, Matt, Kristina, what, if anything, are we drinking today?
Well, I'm drinking tea, very black and very hot. I always do that.
It's a good habit. When I got back from Russia, I was drinking like 4 or 5 just black tea every day, every morning. So it took a while to break the habit, although I would like to go back.
I'm kind of thematically on topic for today. I'm drinking Hearing, which is the original cherry liqueur according to the bottle that I'm drinking from. The Orchard, based on Chekhov's play Cherry Orchard. So I have some nice liqueur in my glass. How about you, Cameron?
I am drinking, also trying to be on brand, so I've got just plain, neat vodka in a mug and some pickles. I was going to bring some black bread too, but I decided probably I didn't want to edit out my crumbs on the cutting floor. Mm-hmm. But yes, so all very on brand for the reading today.
Yes, absolutely.
Since we have Kristina here, we don't want to belabor our usual point about our Patreon, but we would like to extend a thank you to our newest patron, Packrob, as well as a thank you to Caitlin and Janice for upping their contributions.
So, in lieu of a full summary, because we don't want to spoil any major aspects of the book, we want to promote people buying a copy and reading it.
Yes, absolutely. The Orchard is a coming-of-age story set in the USSR in the 1980s, where best friends Anya and Milka try to envision a free and joyful future for themselves. They spend their summers at Anya's dacha, just outside of Moscow, and lazing in the apple orchard listening to Queen songs while fantasizing about trips abroad and the lives of American teenagers. Meanwhile, Anya's parents talk about World War II, the blockade, and the hardships they've endured. And so we were kind of following them through the years, and we won't go too much into the summary because this really is best experienced kind of without too much knowledge. I tried not to read too many summaries going in, and a lot of the parts of the book when they're kind of kicking you, they really come through in a well, I guess good way is the wrong term, but it was very, very effective and really moving. But Before we talk about The Orchard in particular, we want to chat with you a little bit about your own journey as a writer, getting into it, and maybe even some of the habits. It's always interesting to talk to writers about how they, their habits and rituals in writing. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into writing fiction?
Sure. I was a graduate student at Radford University, and it is there that I took a class on women's lit and a second class on political art of Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf. And I have never, ever read those two authors before, even though I graduated from the State Linguistic University in Moscow, but all the authors we studied there, they were male. American authors and British. It so happened. And I think those two women authors, those two geniuses, inspired me to write my own fiction. But also there was a professor that I talk about her all the time, Dr. Moira Baker, who taught those classes. And she was the one who came up to me after one of the classes and suggested I should start writing. And since I've never written anything in Russian, so I was conflicted at the beginning. And I said, well, there's so many native speakers, who write in English, and they can probably tell better stories. And she said, no, I think you have a story to tell. You can tell it well. And, so what if it's not your native tongue? Nabokov did it. Conrad did it. You could do it. And I believed her.
And clearly she was right.
I hope.
I think so. After reading the book, I think I agree.
Thank you. It's a long journey. It took me over 20 years. I've published many, many stories and essays and poetry. But just recently had 2 books coming out within 6 months.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Which is a miracle. It's a miracle, really.
I wanted to ask, because your first collection, What Isn't Remembered, is a short story collection, and this is your debut novel. So I was wondering whether you approached it a little bit differently than your first short story collection. I was listening to an interview that you did with Community Bookstore, and you likened your process of writing to building a house for a feeling to live in. You said, if in 5 years I can go back to the story and it evokes the same feeling, then you would consider it a success. And so so I'm interested in seeing what's the difference between your approach to short story versus novel. And I'm kind of assuming that is maybe the way you might approach the similarities between the two.
Yes. When I said that, I specifically meant a short story. Mm-hmm. It can, of course, applies to writing a novel as well. One difference, and a major difference, that when you write a short story, because it's short, it has no space, every word counts. Mm-hmm. So you constantly think about what to take out, as opposed to writing a novel, a larger landscape. So you're thinking, what should I include? Put in. Mm-hmm. Also, most of the time, short stories are written from 1 or 2 points of view. No, generally from one point of view. And I've always approached a short story as a house, also meaning that I would pick a place in the house where I would stand. And from that angle, I would observe the characters. And because the story is short, you can't travel from one room into another, into another, into another. You just stand there and you get all those moments of being that you record and or narrate in a short story. Novel is large landscape. You can travel up and down the steps, go to any room you wish. If you had to compare the two. Also, I'm often reminded what Raymond Carver said about writing a short story, that a short story is a fury of small punches. We can't do that with a novel, because if you do it in about 30, 40 pages, you'll be so exhausted and you won't be able to continue. Mm-hmm. So it can have one big punch, but or several, but it cannot be a fury of small punches. So there's just a different feeling that you pursue with engaging on such a large journey. I'm also, when I'm working on a novel, I'm also reminded of Morrison, who said that she's like an artist who works with a teeny brush on a large canvas. And so when you step back, you can see the immensity or enormity of that canvas, like Morrison's. But when you work on it so close, chapter by chapter, sentence by sentence, you only see many strokes. So they're not punches or strokes of color, of feelings, of characters, representations. But then in the end, you hold this thing and it's all yours. And it is a canvas of many colors and many characters, many feelings, many emotions, and many events. And much, to me, much sadness, because it's like having a child. You have baby blues in the end.
Yeah, how did you feel when you were able to step away from your canvas after writing the novel? How did it feel to see it in a beautifully illustrated cover in a nice book? Did it still evoke the emotion that you had hoped when you got to, as you're reading through? Yeah.
Yes, because the novel originally was written some years ago, and then, I wrote something else, and I rewrote it, and and it has been rewritten several times. So every time, I would go back to it, the feeling would still be there waiting for me. So it does carry that longing, I should say, for childhood friendship, first love. I consider actually novels, and I said this somewhere already, that to me novels are second tries at first things, first friendships, first loves. So you get to experience that again and again and again. So
That's interesting. When you're writing, do you have like particular ways you come about, like, okay, I need to sit down like every day or every week, like, okay, this is how I do it, or coming to you and like, okay, I'm building the story, I've got to get it out, like, or working at specific times? What's kind of your process for going about it?
Well, I don't write every day, and it's not because I'm lazy. It's just life gets ahead of you. And,
makes sense.
I used to teach, but also used to have a small child. So, and then the child was growing and was getting into music. He's a pianist. So there were moments where I would write during his practices, meaning that I'm constantly in a SoundCloud. But then there were scenes that I had to write, or I have to write in quiet. So I had to work around the schedule. So, but I write whenever I can and whenever I have something to say. I am not one of those people who sit down at the very certain time every day and, stare at the blank page. I don't do that. And blank page doesn't terrify me. Actually, it excites me. There's so much ahead, so much you can do with a blank page. So I get very excited when there's something new. I'm just so excited. But that's how I work. But I also work by, I write by ear. So there has to be an element of surprise for me, maybe for a reader too, but for me, no matter how well I plan, that moment of surprise is very important to me. And it's not because I can't control my characters. In fact, it's that I know that they're real if they surprise me by doing what they do.
I like that.
It's interesting. You mentioned elsewhere that one of the challenges of writing in first person is that it starts to coincide with your own voice. So is that kind of like working for that element of surprise is kind of how you keep making, I guess, externalizing them or making them be real people in a way that you're kind of like almost a conduit telling someone else's story?
You have to separate yourself from your characters, even though they're all your children. So they have traces of your DNA one way or another. But they're not me. And it's, like your child is not you. Your child is allowed to make mistakes of his or her own, right? And to go on living his or her own life, no matter whether you approve of that life or whether it's the life that you hope your child will have. That's the same thing with characters and, short stories or novels. They do come out of you, but at some point they have a life of their own. And so you have to listen to them, to their urges, to their complaints, to their bickering. And what I might say in a given situation is not necessarily what my character will say in a given situation. So I have to be very careful and not to slip into this self-indulgence. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. Hemingway was very self-indulgent. I mean, if you go back to his novels, his Nick characters, they sound a lot like him. So,
yeah, you had an interesting quote in your interview with Christine Sneed, where you said that you end up unearthing your own secrets and seeking ways to justify your own sins. But for a fictional character, it strips away authenticity. So it was an interesting, the way that you posit intimacy versus authenticity. It's not always the same thing at least when you're writing.
No, it's not the same thing because your characters have different lives. Mm-hmm. So if you bring your own intimacy into their lives, it's going to be, not their intimacy, it's yours, and it's your experience, even though they are part of me, but they're allowed to disagree with me. Mm-hmm. I allow them that. They're never mouthpieces. In fact, somebody just told me that one of the most fascinating things about The Orchard was the politics. That how well were the politics integrated, that the writer who told me that said it's very hard to do because at some point you end up preaching. So you end up internalizing and then externalizing your own political views. But because there were so many arguments between the characters about politics, it is very hard to know or to pick whose views is mine. All of those views or none. And I always keep that in mind. I hope I am capable of creating three-dimensional characters.
I think, at least for me, in the way that the politics were integrated, it almost created this apolitical effect in that sense, in that you have these arguments, but they change over time. You have a mother who doesn't like the Soviet Union, and by the end of the book says, well, at least people cared about things back then, which is, at least when I was studying abroad there, something that people would say all the time. So it was a very realistic point to hear, being made. But it also captured this kind of sense, I think, that I guess the part of the coming of age as a teenager, the way that politics are often a backdrop to what it is that you're doing, where you're just kind of like, I just want to do my own thing. I just want to be my own person. And you have all this barking kind of going on in the background. And you're just like, God, enough of, mom and dad fighting about politics or, the neighbors coming by and getting involved. I think it was a very universal sort of feeling that is evoked, at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Right. But also, in that time, perestroika, even if you are a teenager and, we were teenagers and, some of us said, well, whatever. It was such a tumultuous time. It was such a hard time. It was such a unnerving time that we all ended up being part of perestroika.
Sure.
How can you not? And also now the oligarchs are Lopatins. Mm-hmm. They too are Generation Perestroika. Mm-hmm. So that's what's fascinating to me, that generation cleaved in two. They would be people who would, remain honest and decent and hardworking people who would do, anything to make the lives of others better, who are rather selfless. I have a lot of friends like that. But then they would be Lopatins. who don't care about anything other than their own empires. And, like Anya said, if you could, you would have sold stars from the sky. So it puzzles me, and I try to reconcile it in my fiction, how my generation raised pretty much, the same. Eating the same foods, watching the same movies, reading the same books, but how different, we grew up to be. Very different. I mean, like the opposite side of the spectrum.
I think that's going briefly back to the discussion of the politics in the novel. That's one of like the greatest successes is the integration of the politics into like an authentic family life, like Matt was mentioning, of like hearing the kind of the background of the parents, and you're going through life and you're hearing people around you, they're arguing, and you see where they both come from, and like you say, everyone's consuming more or less the same media, and you the characters all are wonderfully authentic because you really begin to feel how, coming from the same starting point, why they're all diverging off, and given their characteristics and their environment and how they're growing up, and it feels you see it's a really effective way of I don't know, analyzing, understanding. I see what you mean when you say you feel like you're trying to hear a story that's even a surprise to you. They're very authentic in that way.
It's true.
So I have a question specifically related to the Orchard and, let's say, Eastern European culture more broadly, just from a little bit about, well, it's a long story. So what, but I'll ask it in the form of a question. One of my linguistics professors here, she has a something for like first year Russian students. It's this intercultural dictionary that students have to match phrases with words, but it shows things that are maybe not exactly how you would translate them. And so this came across to me in the relationship between Milka and Anya. What does it mean to have a friend that's a girl in Russia or Eastern Europe? And this is also in this intercultural dictionary. The word podruga, or like girlfriend, female friend, it carries a different connotation in Eastern Europe. It's at least from what I can understand, what I've been able to glean. And it's not addressed, at least not explicitly, until I think page 87. I marked a quote, which was the first time that I noticed you mention it. But it was implicit all the way up until then. And this is when Anya gets Milka tickets to see Tutsi. And she said it was the best gift anyone had ever given her. And if she were a man, she'd try and dress up like a woman just so she could be friends with me, but without any kind of implied weirdness. But without any kind of implied weirdness, to me, kind of having an understanding of these relationships, it didn't need to be explicit, but maybe for a Western audience, it does. And so I was wondering if you could talk about like writing this intimate and very close relationship that does not have this sort of connotation that Lopatin thinks it might in other areas of the book when he's just, being a pig, for instance. And some of those challenges when you're thinking about your audience writing in English, which is for really a lot of Westerners.
Well, I think it comes from being those kind of relationships that are when a person becomes your second self or your other self, or a darker side to your lighter one, or a lighter one to your darker one. I think it stems from the culture itself, but also from being raised in those tiny apartments without the possibility to ever traveling abroad. And, so really the only outlets that you would have would be reading and friendships. It's very peculiar to maybe Soviet world, probably, to Russian world, but to Soviet world, because what did we do? We spent time together, all the holidays. And the apartments would be so small and so cramped, so you end up sleeping in the same bed, right? And wearing the same clothes. In fact, if someone, I remember, would have somehow procured a pair of jeans, now the rest of us would have to slim down to fit into those jeans, and we would borrow them. That's also very, very specific to that world I came from. So that closeness, I think, came from, having to share such a small space, which has always been kind of paradoxical because Russia, Soviet Union, was an enormous country. I mean, the landscape is enormous. But then we always lived in those small flats and, where we had to cohabitate, all of us. Some of us lived in communal apartments and we shared kitchens and bathrooms, and people would have, they would be like, this room goes to the bathroom at 8 o'clock. This other room, goes at 8:15. So you had to even stand in line to use a toilet. So I think that's where the closeness comes from. And also because you end up spending so much time together. We're so separate here. It's a very individualistic culture where, Soviet Union was a communal culture, and also socialism. That's what it is. You have a community versus the individual. Where here we have individual versus community. I actually had a Q&A session at Hollins where I graduated with another author. And when somebody asked us about the difference between a short story and a novel, she said, well, to me, short stories are about individuals and novels are about community. So I told her, so you're saying short stories are socialist? I mean, or so short stories are capitalist, but, novels are socialist because they're about community. So she was laughing. But honestly, if you think about it, that's what that closeness comes from, where you end up ultimately knowing the other as well, or almost as well as you know yourself. And I think that's why Anya, despite all the new things in her life, right? Everything that she's been able to achieve, and she has a very loving relationship with her husband, the past haunts her. Mm-hmm. Because at some point when they have this conversation about, grieving, Kubler-Ross's article, and she said, but what if your life is inextricable from that of the deceased?
That was my favorite line of the book, by the way.
And so she's grieving for that part of herself, right, that she lost. And that's why, she feels compelled to go back, because she keeps being haunted by that. But we're all, in some ways, I don't know about you guys, you're younger and fresher, as I can see. I don't know if you're haunted by your past, but I certainly am. Mm-hmm. Not just people, but places. Places keep haunting you, and also because the country where I grew up no longer exists. So I can't go back to that country, for better or for worse, but I can't go back to that country. So I kept revisiting it in my stories, novels, my dreams, maybe.
I know we were going to ask the next question, but I had a particular one when we're talking about literary influences. So much Pushkin, I thought, in a lot of the parts, but this one specifically, being haunted by your dreams. I underlined this one passage, and maybe it was just because we just read Eugene Onegin for the podcast, but Anya talking about her being haunted by her dream, where she has to cross this long deserted bridge. All I could think about was the tie-in with Tatiana's dream in Onegin, and the idea of being haunted by this constantly, not in the material world, but still having that weigh on you so heavily. I liked it.
Well, you would be surprised, or maybe not, because everything is connected in the world if you can find that bridge that connects it. But so the novel originally was called The Time Between Wolf and Dog, and that saying is French, used first in literature by Pushkin in Eugene Onegin.
Okay.
So there you go. But that time of the day that he describes is dusk. And the reason that I wanted to title the novel time between wolf and dog, is that I considered perestroika, that time when the old order, had sort of collapsed, but the new one hasn't risen yet. So the old order keeps lingering, just like the sky lingers with color when the sun sets. But the night hasn't arrived yet. So, but my publisher, my editor, they kept saying that they just didn't want that title because no one could remember that title. And they kept calling the novel that Russian novel. So we had to go to the orchard, even though I was against the orchard.
Really? Okay.
To begin with, yeah. But
Interesting.
Right.
So initially you mentioned that in a lot of ways, the orchard is kind of coming from like the story you wanted to tell, and then connecting that to seeing a production of the play, the Cherry Orchard. So was that element originally, was that kind of something that came in more in later drafts as you were kind of rewriting it, and that became more prominent, or was that always there?
Well, the original story that was published in the Southern Review and is actually in my collection, Champions of the World. That's what it's called, Champions of the World. That story had only two characters, Milka and Anya. But I kept going back to them because people kept asking me, is this should be a novel. Is there a longer piece? Because the story itself was almost 40 pages. And so when I sat down to finally turn that story into a novel, and that also coincided with me traveling to Moscow and seeing the Cherry Orchard at the Moscow Art Theater, where it was originally staged. I believe it was 1893, something like that. But so as I was watching the play and listening to the characters talk, especially Trofimov, the eternal student, his, so to speak, sermons about life and how we must work. And I'm sitting there thinking, my God, it's so familiar. It just sounds so familiar. He's talking about the same thing. I mean, 100 years ago, they talked about this. Now they still talk about this. And I said, that may be, something to think about. And once I started writing, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And also the four characters, there are four elements. Lapatin is fire, because he really burns everything in his wake. He burns those books and stuff. And then, of course, Trifonov has asthma, so he's always starved for air. And, he's kind of a spirit, too, because he's a spiritual leader. So he's air. And then there's Milka. She's called Sprat. There's a tiny fish. And she is kind of very, slippery character in many ways. And sort of, they do have lots of, remember, they swim. They take baths together. So she is the water. And then Anya, of course, is the earth because, for one thing, she's the barrier, right, of all the stories. And she plants the orchard, so she's connected, the orchard, so she's connected to the earth, but also because she's sort of, she grounds everyone, and so she is the earth, and also I hope the earth survives, it goes on existing. So that was my take on the characters, but of course Lapatin is based on Lapachin and Trifonov on Trofimov.
Right. Interesting. So slightly kind of change up the topic a little bit, but I want to go back briefly to something you said earlier about the interesting paradox of the Soviet Union being such a large country and yet land being something that was people being so close together in these apartment complexes. I thought that's something that was represented really well when we get to, okay, and this part I'm going to drop some spoilers for later in the book, so I'll if you look at the show notes, you can skip to a time card where we're not going to be discussing that. When we're, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and when Anya's, back, and Lopatin and I forget his name, or their company are trying to buy the dacha all the dacha that are out, in the countryside. I was thinking it's really interesting to have this country which land has before, land has always been important, but suddenly now land has value, and dachas outside of Moscow or something like that's where we can build. That's where someone can make a fortune in one way or another. And I think it's really interesting. Also, kind of getting to you saying that kind of like the basic difference between the socialist and capitalist world is that sense of community, which is kind of inherent, maybe because of the apartment complexes, which is now, like you say, it's the world that exists. It's got a spiritual presence, but it's also kind of dead. And people are now living in this new individualist world where maybe their dachas are worth something, and someone wants to speculate on it or something like that. I thought that was a powerful feeling. There's a lot of literature reading about this era which conveys it in different ways, and this was a really very powerfully personal one. But speaking of dachas, the actual question I wanted to ask was, so for some of our readers who may be a little bit less familiar with Russian culture, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of the dacha? Because this is a very important piece of the book, the dacha, or Anya's parents' dacha.
A lot of people, when I was growing up, and I grew up in Moscow, so a lot of people in the cities would have a small country house, usually about 70 to 100 miles from the city. And generally, the piece of land that you were given to kind of a free farm, it was given by the government through your work, usually. And usually it was a very small parcel of land. All you could do is build a small house, and then, of course, to grow vegetables or fruit. Some people, for example, had 2 parcels of land, one from one, they both worked in the same co-op, say, and they'll tell them, okay, you can have 2 because they both work here. But generally they were very small. And then you build a house there. You own the house, but you don't own the land. So technically you couldn't, back then, you couldn't sell it. You could bequeath it. You could exchange it, but you couldn't sell it. Perestroika changed all that. So we became owners of those small parcels of land, or, our little gardens that we grew there. And so it was very common, and I know that most people would try to grow anything they could. Therefore, like, we had a dacha, and I remember there was just one small path from the gates, like a wicket gate, to the house, and the rest was covered with gooseberry bushes, some apples, some cherries, could be like strawberry patches. My mother did not like to work in the garden. So I remember my grandmother and me and my cousins always had to work, put manure under the trees, for example. Yeah, I mean, we were rewarded later with jam. And that's how they would make us do things. You've got to do this now, you dig in this manure, but then later on, you're going to have those beautiful apples, and, you're going to make some jams and stuff. And then there were currants, I remember, and raspberries. Not much, but enough to eat and enjoy, and maybe can some. So later in the winter, you have something to eat, you can survive. But some people never had such opportunity, so they never had a dacha. And, it was considered unfortunate because a dacha is like a little escape from the city into the wilderness. Although it was not really the wilderness, but around it there were forests and rivers. You could kind of, your gaze rested. I loved it. I loved going to the dacha, even though it was very poorly constructed. We did not, just like Anya, all our utilities, toilets and stuff, everything was outside. And when we had to take showers, indeed, we had to heat up buckets and buckets of water. And A lot of times when we were little, we took showers outside behind the main house. It was, now I think of it as a fun time. But back then, it was an undertaking. And my grandmother, my grandmother and my grandfather, who always stayed with us at the country house because our parents worked. Now, I remember how they tried to teach us things so we could survive later. So, and some of it did go into the orchard because the way those characters navigate through lives. Maybe it's not so different from any teenager, but it is very different for those characters because they inherited the country that one day just crumbled, collapsed. Not every teenager goes through that, the loss of a country. And of course that brought the loss of many things. Friendships and loves and parents, but the loss of a country, it's a hard thing to bear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering, especially talking about going through this perestroika period, some of the people that we've read have echoed this similar sentiment that was in towards probably the end of The Orchard. But I'm wondering kind of how you feel going through that, this relationship between nature and man, nature and people. This is such a prevalent theme throughout the book. And some of the people that we've read, like just for instance, for the podcast, we've read Prilepin, and there's a really extensive parts of his books talking about the destruction of nature, essentially. And the decay of these places that used to be beautiful and that still carry this kind of nostalgic value. And so I'm wondering kind of how you see that. Maybe it's specifically having to do with the dacha culture of Eastern Europe, or if it's something greater, perhaps.
I think it has something to do with at least with the Russian culture, because if you go back to the cherry orchard, and you would see the same again. Maybe that's why I had to write The Orchard, or that's why I wrote it the way I wrote it. Because if you go back to the cherry orchard, you see how those characters talk about the estate, the garden, the cherry orchard that doesn't produce enough cherries. They can't do anything with them. I mean, it's half dried out. And that estate also is kind of falling apart, even though it once was prosperous and posh. And of course, it's an allusion to the it's the country that's falling apart, right? But it was not that much different in Chekhov's times, as it was and is in our times. So the destruction of nature, that theme, was one of Chekhov's favorite themes. That the men can destroy anything around them. And that's what I believe, that's also an allusion on the cherry orchard when Trifonov says that, when they talk about the garden, the orchard and how beautiful it is and everything and how eternal eternal, nature is eternal, it's beauty. And, the trees, they survive the blizzards and they look dead, but then comes spring. And then Trifonov says, and yet a man can destroy them with a simple axe, like anything around him. But that's an allusion to the cherry orchard. So it's not really Prilepin's, theme, right? So if you go back to Russian literature, Soviet literature, but also Russian literature, that theme was always there. But I think Chekhov was obsessed with the destruction that men bring to this earth, and how, all of his plays deal with that. Not just with art, loneliness with human beings, but also with destruction of nature and of the world around us.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, for The Orchard, definitely. I kind of wonder too, because trees, obviously, you can destroy them with an axe, but I wonder about some of the other imagery in the book too, because there's a lot of imagery with water specifically, and there's almost this sublime description of the way that water is represented that made me think a little bit about Pushkin as well. On page 153, they're looking out on the water saying, "Naked, the four of us faced the darkness, the terrifying infinity of water and night sky." And I know we were talking about dusk, and I guess it's the transition to night. But just that sublime feeling that you can have when you look out and you can't see the end of the water, the sky. I guess we see it's mocking, saying Lopatin could sell the stars from the sky, it kind of like denigrates almost the sublime aspect of a night sky or of the water or something like that. But that's very much a feeling that emanates from the novel, I thought.
Yeah, well, water also symbolizes rebirth. But it's also night time when they're there, right? So we don't see, they can't see what is to come. And, once we finish the novel, we know what is to come. So they don't see their future. You know what I'm saying? But they are naked. There's rebirth. They come out of the water and they look at all that ahead of them that they can't see in those countries, but also their future. And behind them, the land they could never leave, right? And even though Anya does leave, but does she really? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? So she can never leave that land. And not physically. Physically, she did leave. But the land and the country keeps haunting her because it holds all her memories, sad, happy, but it holds all those youth memories. And we all, well, not you guys, you're still very, very young, but all of us, we long for our youth, and I guess it's in human nature to long for one's youth, but also because everything is still ahead of you. Everything is possible. So it's not per se even those memories, but it's the feeling of being able to do whatever you want to do. One of my favorite films, it's a Paulo Sorrentino's film, Youth. It's actually one of his English language films, because most of his films are in Italian language. So, but in that movie, and I just rewatched it recently, that's why I'm quoting. But among many things in that movie is, say, what I would love to do with novels. It's to express the ineffable, which is that movie does brilliantly. But there, an old filmmaker is teaching a young student, right? He has a few students with him. Not per se how to make films or to write scripts, but how to imagine or envision something. So they're in the Swiss Alps and they're looking through a telescope. And he tells his student to look through this one end of the telescope. And what he sees, and the student says, "Oh, everything's so close, it's so bright." And he says, "Yes, that's your future." Because he is young. And then he turns around the telescope and asks the student to look from the other side. And what do you see? "Oh, everything is so dark, kind of far away, shriveled." And the old filmmaker says, "Yes, because that's my past." So there's a different perspective. So the youth, when you're young, holds that perspective that everything is big and bright, and you're capable of achieving whatever you set to achieve. But then, the telescope is turned around. So the novel for me, is like a telescope turned around.
Right.
And there's all that past that Anya is, held close, and then, but it really is the past. But she's tethered.
Still visible.
Right. She can't leave it behind. It's right there. even though it's far away.
It reminds me from a line from in English, Ludmila Ulitska's The Funeral Party, which when the characters are all watching the August coup happen on the or news about the August coup, and each of them all coming from different backgrounds, saying that most of them had kind of disconnected themselves from the old country, but seeing this happen now, kind of they began to realize that this country sat in their souls, sat in their guts, and it was something that would never truly go away.
Yeah, well, I was there when the coup took place. I was there on the streets. I remember everything very, very, very well and vivid. But I think these were the moments actually, even though no matter how tremulous and sad and tragic they were, those were moments of brightness for us because we fought for our future and we believed that we could achieve a better future. So I think democracy, if we ever had any, was there at the moment in 1991 and maybe in 1993. But after that, something just sort of went wrong.
Kind of a sad note to leave it off on, but I think that it's been a wonderful conversation, and we wanted to pose to you and ask you about what do you think looks next for you in your author's note, which, by the way, if you for those of you, hopefully you've all read the book if you're listening to this, but if you haven't, obviously go and buy it and you'll find the links in the show notes. But there's also a wonderful author's note at the end, which kind of talks through a lot of how the orchard came to be. And for you, this is a story that's been a long time coming. So what are you looking at anything in particular next, or working on anything big? If it's a secret, that's, you just say that, but.
I did finish a new novel.
Oh.
I just finished it. It's called Sputnik Hotel. Okay. It's set at pretty much the same times, maybe a few years into the future, but the same time, 1986, 1987, but has a completely different story, different characters. It's a love triangle between two boys and a girl. They all have secrets, and they fight not so much for the future of their country, although they ended up doing that too, but the two boys fight for the girl. And it takes a long time and a long, life practically to find out what really happened and who gets the girl. That's very important, who gets the girl. But it also, it has a happier ending, let's put it this way, or maybe a more optimistic ending.
Sure.
Although one person who read it, my husband, said, well, so he does get the girl, but then he paused, and he said, did he? Or did he imagine getting the girl? So I always love that kind of...
Yeah.
So do we really know?
Yeah.
Or is that something he imagined and wrote about and crafted a book out of his memories? And I would like for the readers, to decide whether it really did happen, or whether, he reconstructed his memories and gave them the ending that he desired. So it's done. So we're ready, my agent and I are ready to submit it. And I just finished a short story, the war short story. I guess it's my duty as an artist to be speaking out against the war. And so that short story is called the Kiev Symphony. And it has parallels to Shostakovich's The Leningrad Symphony, the Seventh Symphony. And it is about an old Soviet composer, one of the last living Soviet composers who had been proposed by the FSB people to write a symphony, and victorious symphony, to welcome Russian soldiers back from the war. And what that composer turns around does is in the story. and it's called the Kiev Symphony, and it's dedicated, of course. It's also my symphony that's dedicated to the Ukrainian people and everyone who fights to protect their country and save their country. So we will see what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember reading an interview you gave, I think maybe last month, where you were talking about Shostakovich's, or Shostakovich, he always say Shostakovich, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. That now, in this context, that I see where the thoughts are coming from.
Yeah, it's a very important symphony in the sense that, he wrote it fairly quickly, maybe less than 6 months, but it's a enormous undertaking. There are 4 movements, and there were speculations that there's no way he could have written it in such a short period of time, and that he began writing it before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So it was not really, some people speculate that it was not really against Hitler so much as Stalin, or both. So it was against tyranny, and it was dedicated to all the people who died from that tyranny, in the gulags, as well as, during the blockade, and those who survived. Because through his music, he could talk to those people. And that's why it is so important to this particular story. And also because it's really not, it's not a victorious symphony. And that's why in the first movement, we have that bassoon solo, even though Stalin expected this, grand finale with brass and all that, But what he got was this, kind of a weird, haunting, pleading sound, the bassoon, which, some people compared of a mother's cry, a mother pleading, for her murdered children. So it's a very important symphony. And so that's why, I've been researching it, I've been listening to it. Of course, my son is a pianist, so, I know a lot about music. And it was very interesting to draw those parallels in my story. But we will see. We shall see. Maybe it's a bad story. I don't know.
It sounds like a lot of thought was going into it, and like you say, I think I'm when it comes out, I'm really interested in reading it.
Well, if it comes out, but I like your take on it when it comes out. That's better. That's better. Yeah, that's the attitude. I love that attitude. That's also it's one of the attitudes I love about this country. We think about when, not if. Where I come from, it's always an if. Because like those characters, they're facing their future, but it's very dark.
Yeah, but there's always art.
There's art. That's what we live for, and that's what will save humanity. Art. Dostoevsky believed it would be what? Beauty. It would save the world. I think art would save the world. Yeah. Here's to all artists.
Here's to all. I'll hold on. Let me pour real quick. Let me do quick. There we go. Proper toast.
Right.
To all artists. And
cheers to all artists. May it survive the evil.
Yes, exactly. And hopefully people can look back on it in the future and laugh and love and cry and think about it and everything that it can bring out in the human emotion.
Yes, art bears witness always.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think I'll ever quite forget being in. I know this is a goodbye almost, but I'll never quite forget being in Petersburg and visiting one of the mass graves, and they're pumping out. I think they're playing the Seventh Symphony, and it's a very constructed experience, but all the same was very emotional. And I remember just staring out across all the graves, and I think brought up to the edge of tears, maybe even crying, just listening to the music and staring out at the costs of war.
Right. The costs of war, exactly so. And that's what we're looking at now, the costs of war. And I know there would be many people who would write or compose the Kiev Symphony. So.
Well, Kristina, thank you so much for being here today. This has been a wonderful conversation and very enlightening, especially about the themes of the book, which also, again, Definitely. You should all absolutely go out and get, and you can find all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for inviting me and for reading The Orchard. It was our pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a great time.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, as much as we're loath to move on from this wonderful conversation, Matt, we do have to talk about what we're going to be reading for next time. And this is kind of an interesting one, actually.
Yes, next episode we're going to be sitting down with Dr. Jose Vergara to talk about his book, All Futures Plunge to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature. We're going to be reading Yuri Olesha's book, Envy, and then we're going to be discussing Dr. Vergara's book, which touches on envy and its connection to Joyce. And it's going to be a real kicker. We got a lot to go through in about an hour, so you're going to want to tune in.
It's a lot. Okay, let me admit something to you right here, Matt. I did not look up when we were doing this before we recorded, and yeah, spoiler alert, behind the scenes, we already recorded this. I did not realize that Envy was a full novel. I thought it was a book because we had the text of Dr. Vergara's book, and I was like, well, I'll read that, read the short story. Day before we record, I sit down to pull up Envy, and I realized that it is not a short story. It is, in fact, a whole 170-page book.
I told you it was a novella.
I know, and then I forgot because I'm not a very good co-host. So that was a very hectic day. I'm glad I already didn't have plans. I went from like a fun little coffee shop read to a very serious coffee shop read.
Oh my God, I gotta finish. I mean, I think the episode came out good, if I do say so myself.
It was a good read. Glad I was able to read it all through in one sitting. I think that actually made it better. And then the episode itself was also so much fun, and I'm looking forward to you all hearing it.
Indeed. Well, before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons who we are so close to getting back to publishing 3 times a month. We're like $6 away from our goal. So if you want to help your favorite Russian literature podcast boost back up to 3 times per month, go ahead and check us out at patreon.com/Tipsy Tolstoy to join with our current patrons. We've got so many wonderful faces. We've got Janice, Jeff, Jesse, Madeline, Ann, Daniel, another Daniel, who we also love, Lou, Paige, Alex, Brandon, Cole, Irini, Darren, Jack, Larkin, Allison, Elise, Joanne, Yitza, Caitlin, Mysterious Donor Dude, Stephanie, Julie, Brett, Austin, Eli, Isaac, Packrab, and Zachary. Like I said, so many wonderful people. Podcasting isn't free, and grad school refuses to pay me very well, no matter how much I complain in my episodes. So if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at patreon.com/Tipsy Tolstoy.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast, or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast. You'll hear from us again soon. You said it funny.